Okay, so now let's talk about the cost trajectories of wind power. So in general, over the last 20 years, turbine increases in turbine size and experience have both driven cost declines in wind turbines. At the same time, the cost of wind turbines is still exposed to commodity prices. So increases in copper and steel can increase the price of wind energy effectively. Um, so that's what we see here. We see this dramatic decrease in the levelized cost of electricity from wind farms, certainly over the last 25 years. And a lot of what's driven that are increases in turbine size, as well as the siting of wind farms in more advantageous areas with higher wind speeds. You do see this sort of blip around 2010 where prices actually started to increase and then they start to go back down again. And that was actually due to exposure to commodity prices. There was an increase between 2005 and 2010 in the price of copper and steel, and that drove the cost of wind energy up, at least the cost of new wind farms up. So how is wind power actually sold? So there's a couple options here. The first would be wholesale electricity markets. And so the sale of electricity here would be very similar to the discussions we've already had about how other types of power plants sell electricity into wholesale electricity markets. Is a little bit different for variable renewable energy providers like wind and solar, and that's because so much of the cost of wind and solar is tied up in the capital cost that their actual variable cost, which remember is the actual cost that gets bid into wholesale markets. It's the basis on which different types of generation are competing with each other. The variable cost of wind and solar is basically zero. And as a result, and that's because there's no fuel cost, as a result, when wind is bidding directly into a wholesale market for electricity, it's almost always taken by the market. And what that means is that when it's taken by the market, it's pushing out or displacing some other type of generation that's more expensive. And probably it's another type of generation that is polluting more in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So we can take a look at the sort of a traditional system supply curve. Remember, this is what we would refer to as the merit order. So we're organizing total system capacity within a market of different types of generation in order of increasing costs. So we start at the bottom left and we have hydropower and wind and solar. And then a little bit to the right of that, we have nuclear, and then coal is in gray, natural gas is in pink, and then oil is in black. So oil is the most expensive, and renewables are the cheapest. But remember, we're only talking about the variable cost of electricity, not the levelized cost. This has nothing to do with how much it actually costs to build the power plants, only how much it costs to generate electricity once you've already built them. And so because wind and solar are towards the bottom left, that means that they're going to be taken first by the market if the goal is to minimize the costs of meeting electricity. And so remember, if you are, when we talk about wholesale electricity markets, we're talking about the intersection of supply and demand. And the price of electricity is set by the intersection, or the point on the y-axis that's associated with the intersection between supply and demand. And if you are to the left of that intersection, where renewables are here, that means you get to sell electricity at the market price. But if you're to the right of that intersection, it means you were too expensive and you were outcompeted by other sources of generation. And for the time being, the market doesn't actually need you. And so because wind energy and solar too is almost always taken by the market because of its very low variable cost, sometimes you'll hear about wind and solar being treated as what's called demand reduction by system operators. And what that means is that instead of thinking about wind and solar as a source of supply of electricity, we're actually talking about them as negative demand. We won't use this terminology much in this class just because I don't want to confuse things, but a lot of times if you read about the way wind and solar are treated in wholesale markets, it is in this context as demand reduction. And so that's what this figure is trying to show. We see original electricity demand shown here in yellow, and then the pink represents electricity demand once you subtract out wind power. So the periods of this figure where you see the pink and the yellow lines are really close together, that means there's not that much wind available. But the periods of this figure where you see that there's a big vertical difference between yellow and pink, that means that there is a lot of wind available that day, and so that net demand is a lot lower. So wind is almost always taken by the market. But what that doesn't guarantee, I mean, that's advantageous for wind power producers, but what it doesn't always guarantee is that the price is high. And so remember, when we're thinking about the investment value of a wind farm, right, whether it is a good decision or a bad decision to build a wind farm, we might think about using net present value, the same way we've looked at using net present value to evaluate other decisions, the value of other types of power plants in this class. And it's the exact same premise here, right, where you have some future flow of cash flows or profits, CT, that are discounted out into the future. So that means that future revenues or profits way out into the future matter less than ones we experience in the near term. And we all add all of those discounted cash flows up, and we get this one score called net present value. And if it's positive in general, we might think that that's a project that shows some economic viability or promise, and if it's negative, it would be a clear indicator that the project is sort of a no-go. So what determines profits for a wind farm? One would be how much electricity that they produce. The other would be the price at which they sell that electricity. So what can influence wholesale electricity prices? So we've talked about this some already in this class. Especially within the context of the nuclear power industry, which has seen a loss of existing nuclear power plants, and a lot of the planned projects have not materialized, in large part because those nuclear power plants would be selling electricity into markets where the price of electricity is too low. And there are lots of reasons for why the prices have been low recently, and part of that is because of a slowdown in electricity demand growth. Part of that, a huge part of that, has been low natural gas prices, which of course are low because of increased supply from fracking. And then another part of that is rapid growth in renewable energy, which push prices down as well. So remember, if we think about the generation mix that makes up a system supply curve, we have different types of generation types, all of which have different roles within the grid. We have peaking resources, baseload resources, and they also all have different variable costs. Now, what we've just talked about recently is that wind and solar have a variable cost of 0. And we also see here that the variable cost of natural gas can be either low or high, and that depends on the price of natural gas. So when you have a low price of natural gas, which is what we've really experienced in the US over the last 10 years, the part of the system supply curve that's associated with natural gas plants gets a lot lower, and that's because the price of electricity from natural gas plants goes down if the price of the fuel, natural gas, goes down. And so the system supply curve changes a little bit. And then as a result, even if demand doesn't change, and even if the generation mix doesn't change, only if gas prices go down, the wholesale price of electricity goes down too. So if you are a wind farm and you're in a market where the price of natural gas has declined a lot, and that's driven wholesale prices down, that means you're making less money. And so in some cases, renewable energy can be negatively impacted by low natural gas prices. So that's wholesale markets. A very common, another very common, probably more common way in which renewable energy in general, including wind power, is marketed is through what are called power purchase or offtake agreements. And so these are long-term bilateral contracts between a developer, so somebody who, or an owner of a wind farm, who sells electricity, and a utility who buys the electricity and then delivers that to end retail consumers. And so this is in some ways, or has been, a way for renewable energy developers to reduce uncertainty in the price, because part of the agreement here is that the contract between the seller, which would be the entity that owns the wind power project, and the buyer, which would be a utility or a big corporate electricity user that purchases the electricity, that price that's being exchanged is fixed. Right, so here's an example where a wind developer would sell electricity to Duke Energy, who would then sell that electricity to its retail customers at a retail rate. But Duke Energy is paying a fixed dollar per megawatt hour rate to the wind power developer, and that's good for the wind power developer because it allows it to get a bit more certainty about what its revenues are going to be on a year-to-year basis. So what determines the price in a power purchase agreement? So this is a negotiated amount between the buyer and the seller. And it could reflect a couple different things, and it might be influenced by the exact reasons why the utility would be buying renewable energy. For example, if if a utility was required legally by a renewable energy portfolio standard in a certain state to reach a certain amount of renewable energy as part of its portfolio, or to meet a certain amount of its electricity demand, it might put out a solicitation for offers. And it might take the cheapest offer, right? It would allow different wind developers to compete with one another, and whichever developer could build a farm for the cheapest would win, essentially. And so, in that sense, the levelized cost of electricity from wind is part of what determines the offtake agreement. So, as the levelized cost of electricity declines, utilities are able to buy electricity from wind farms for cheaper and cheaper. And so in some ways, this creates a race to the bottom among wind farms where they're competing with each other for market share. Other things that can influence the offtake price for wind farms would be the avoided cost of electricity for the utility. So in some sense, what the utility wants to do is pay for electricity from a wind farm for a price that is equal to or less than the amount that it would be paying to generate its own electricity, right? So we could think about that as potentially the cost of electricity from a natural gas power plant. So let's say that the price of natural gas declines, and if you're Duke Energy, and you're looking for cheap ways to meet electricity demand for your customers, and your choice is to produce electricity at your own natural gas plant, or to sign a contract where you can buy electricity from a wind farm. So you're not going to buy electricity from a wind farm if that electricity costs more than the electricity that you would be generating from your own natural gas plant. And so that would be referred to as the avoided cost of electricity. So utilities are probably only going to want to pay wind farms an amount that is less than it would cost them to produce electricity at a natural gas plant. And again, that's a reason why, as natural gas prices decline, prices for wind farms, revenues for wind farms may decline too. So what this shows is a levelized cost of levelized PPA prices, so power purchase agreement prices between wind farms and offtake utilities throughout in different parts of the United States over the last 20 years or so. And what we can see in here in particular is that the power purchase agreement price it actually tracked commodity prices. If you go back and sort of look at the slide where I showed the levelized cost of electricity increasing for wind farms, basically between 2005 and 2010 and 11, that was due to commodity prices, increased costs of copper and steel, and so that's what's reflecting this big spike that's shown in that during that time period here as well. Now, recently, wind farm offtake agreements have become extremely cheap, and that's what's shown here, especially in the interior of the United States, in the the Great Plains region, those purple circles are getting lower and lower and are very cheap at this point. So lower electricity prices, or levelized cost of electricity um, for wind farms, and lower PPA prices are a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, for a utility, for Duke Energy, who is trying to increase the amount of renewable energy it depends on, it's now cheaper than it's ever been to buy wind power. And to then provide that to their customers. The downside is for wind developers themselves. Despite growth in wind power capacity and falling costs, which is part of what's spurring that growth, there's increased competition among wind developers, and wholesale electricity prices are low because of low natural gas prices. So what that means is that rock bottom prices for wind developers mean that some renewable energy providers operate on a pretty thin profit margin. And so what that's led to in some cases is consolidation. So small renewable energy developers get bought out by big ones. And the reason why is because in some cases because of economies of scale. So if big providers are able to streamline development and production and personnel costs, they can experience economies of scale. So their costs on average go down lower the more they can produce. So in some cases, big wind energy developers are better positioned to offer more competitively priced wind power than our smaller developers. One of the other reasons that big, renewable energy companies might be better positioned than smaller renewable energy companies in the future is because they may experience a lower cost of capital. Remember, so when the energy business is extremely capital intensive, even for renewable energy, especially for renewable energy. So much of the cost of renewable energy is the capital cost of the project. And what really helps influence that is the borrowing cost. So if a renewable energy developer wants to build a $100 million wind farm, they're not just going to pay $100 million for that. They're going to borrow $100 million to build a wind farm and then pay off that loan gradually with a lot of interest over the lifetime of the project. And so the lifetime cost of the project directly influences what the break-even cost of electricity, the levelized cost of electricity is for an individual wind farm. So if you pay lower interest on the money that you borrow to build a wind farm, you're able to sell electricity for a cheaper rate. And so it's possible that larger firms may be able to pay lower interest rate on the money they borrow because they have higher credit ratings. So they have a lower probability of debt default because they're larger, more established. And so that ability to borrow money for less at lower interest might also be a competitive advantage for larger renewable energy developers as well. Okay, so that's it for this one. Please read reading number 8 for next time. And next time we're going to talk about solar power.